Before we begin the next program, we would like to say that, in our opinion, it is not suitable for web users who may be of a nervous disposition. In 1966, Professor Brett invented the internet at the top of the post office tower, but it took another 3 decades before the BBC started using the new medium. From a very early stage, Doctor Who was a required part of the BBC's online revolution. But at least in the early days, no one was quite sure why.
So the BBC registered a domain name really quite early because the Research and Development Department in Kingswood Warren were really interested in the internet as a new medium of communication. And I think John Burt isn't the most beloved of Director Generals, but he saw a real opportunity for the BBC there in a new publishing medium.
The BBC's first proper website launched in 1997. There were 2 of them. BBC Online was run by the BBC primarily as a programme information service, and BBC Worldwide launched Beeb.com.
Beeb.com was a commercial website set up by BBC Worldwide and another company. It was a joint venture. And the idea was to leverage popular brands like Match of the Day, Top of the Pops, and also things like Doctor Who, which, although was no longer on the air, was still a really successful brand for them, along with Blake Seven and Red Dwarf. And so they used a TV show called Tomorrow's World Plus as kind of the overarching brand.
So there was a sort of fledgling web operation at the BBC. Notably, if you look at the Politics 97 website, it has a credits page as if it's a TV programme with mugshots and names of all the people who were involved, including the people who coded it.
Suddenly there was a bit of a battle for who owned which particular brand, and you'd find there'd be a Top of the Pops site on Beeb.com and a Top of the Pops site on BBC Online, and there'd be meetings and more meetings, and suddenly you found yourself in a little bit of a war zone.
In 1999, BBC Two began an ambitious series of Doctor Who repeats, and the BBC's first proper Doctor Who website was launched. Sadly, the repeats didn't last very long, and yet no stranger to cancellation, somehow the Doctor Who website hung around, becoming part of the BBC's range of cult sites.
I was working on developing a proposal to do animated episodes of Doctor Who for broadband, and while this was being developed and signed off, I was moved over to look after the BBC's cult and Doctor Who websites.
There was a weird thing where suddenly old stuff was cool regardless of whether it was good or not, and the BBC's cult website was kind of like a sort of dumping ground for weird quirky stuff that the BBC had done. So you would have Bagpuss alongside Rent-A-Ghost, but also had things that were currently transmitting, so there was a lot of Buffy stuff on there as well. It was a really weird hodgepodge of things, and really rather enjoyable to discover that other people like these things, even if they weren't terribly good.
It was okay to like these sites, but not to kind of be an open geeky fan, and so there was some kind of kudos around what sites you liked or what shows you liked, but in a kind of a cool, knowing way rather than in a fan-like way.
It was things like the Buffy website would have a reviewer who each week would go, "Another lackluster episode." And a lot of my job was to actually try and say, we quite like some of these programmes.
But what happened to the plan to make new episodes of Doctor Who online?
Making new episodes of Doctor Who on broadband ground to a halt when somebody realised it was actually going to cost a lot of money. And instead I was told, oh, they've made a pilot episode for Radio 4 that the radio don't want. Let's put that out on the internet instead.
I'd kind of vaguely known that Radio 4 had been looking at doing some Doctor Who things, and you'd had like the Ghosts of N-Space and those kind of radio stories, but the idea that the web was going to be the home of Doctor Who was really rather exciting.
Dan Friedman's abandoned radio episode of Doctor Who became the BBC's first ever drama webcast. Securing the rights for it paved the way for the streaming of radio programmes online, and later for the BBC iPlayer.
BBC Rights Department was very cagey about setting any precedent whatsoever for online at the time. All BBC fees for artists and for writers and for photographers have been hammered out over years, decades of negotiation with artist rights groups and through just yearly arguments about what tiny increment somebody's going to get. But we didn't have that for online. So we were basically making it up as we went along, and we were very nervous of making the wrong decision and leaving the BBC paying more for online rights than it needed to have.
The technology for the 2001 broadcast of Death Comes to Time was primitive, relying on signals beamed down old copper telephone lines. Modems were 1/100th of the speed of modern broadband. For sending out sound and occasionally video to home users, the BBC relied on a piece of software called Real Player.
It was the best thing around, and the amazing thing about Real Player was that it did allow you to watch video using a dial-up internet connection, but it allowed you to do it very, very, very slowly.
You have to remember that everybody had a lot less bandwidth in those days, so modems that ran at 56k was kind of as fast as it got.
The picture size would probably be about the size of a postage stamp. It would be incredibly grainy, and every few minutes you'd be seeing a sort of buffering symbol going round and round and round. It would be completely unwatchable.
It sounded like it had been filmed underwater. That's probably the closest I can come to it. It's sort of a weird burbly quality to it as it came down the line.
There is no way on or off the planet. No help is coming.
Hello, I'm the Doctor.
One hidden advantage of Real Player was that it included a programming language, in theory, designed to add subtitles.
It was decided that Real Player was just about good enough to let people listen to sound using dial-up, but that for Death Comes to Time, some kind of picture was needed, some kind of animation. And at that point, we were told about a technology that had been designed for subtitling, and we used it to create animation, kind of. A little bit like Jack and Ori, if you squinted. But it kind of worked for Death Comes to Time.
Artist Lee Sullivan drew some pictures, and the BBC web team moved them around. A little.
You'd had video clips on the news website before, but nothing that was an original drama or an original production. And I think it was a real forerunner in that way, and it made a lot of other departments in the BBC realise that there was potential to do interesting things on the web in entertainment and drama, not just with clips of talking heads for the news programmes.
Despite everything, a failed radio Doctor Who had become an online success. But not too much of a success. The BBC Rights Department had been worried it would have an audience of several billion. In fact, it managed a very respectable 100,000.
I remember the excitement of watching Death Comes to Time and logging onto my computer and finding it a bit clunky, but the fact that it was new, Doctor Who was more than enough to overcome the kind of the restrictions of how it was being delivered, and you just wanted more.
The first webcast of Death Comes to Time, I think, was more exciting than anybody expected, certainly in the rights group, because I think we thought you just put it up as a piece of radio but on a website. I don't think anybody conceived of it having a very entertaining, interactive edge. So that was unexpected, I'd say.
I actually watched one of the episodes of Death Comes to Time on my in-laws' computer in Dubai on a modem that was even slower than the one that you would get in the UK. It was a painful experience of buffering and stuttering. It would stop, it would start. You would sit there for 2 minutes waiting to see whether the connection had dropped or whether it was ever going to start playing again. But I was so excited about seeing new Doctor Who that even though it was some static-ish moving images and took ages to watch, I was there gripped.
The BBC website, that week called BBC I, then hit a problem.
And immediately fans were going, well, how long until we get episode 2? And the answer was a long time, because we spoke to Dan and we said, can we have episode 2 in a couple of months? Can we get more of it? And the answer that came back from Dan was, you're going to have to wait over a year for episode 2.
While waiting for more Death Comes to Time, the BBC website filled in the gap with photo novels of missing episodes, using off-air pictures or telesnaps.
There was a thing in the 1960s where if you were a director and you had a piece of television going out, there was no way of videoing it, but you'd pay a nice man called John Cura to take a lot of pictures while it was going out. And what this meant was that although these episodes no longer existed in the archive, John Cura's telesnaps of them did. And there were about 70 of them for an episode, and we took an episode of Fury from the Deep and we just turned it into a photo novel online. It was a really basic, simple thing, and you would just click, click, click and go through it. And it was one of those things of trying to explain it to my managers, and they kind of stared at me and blinked. But then the first episode went out and it was the most incredible success. The first episode had something like 300,000 page impressions.
The problem was this was the age of the .com, an era of beanbags, microscooters, and wild ideas.
There was very much a culture in the internet. If you can't do a thing and just stay with it, you've got to fiddle with it. So immediately, you'd be going to meetings where somebody would say, well, these Doctor Who photo novels, they're brilliant, they're really brilliant. Let's mix it up, okay? Let's let people make up their own photo novel stories. They can take these pictures and make their own adventures, and that will work really well, and that's absolutely brilliant. That's how we've got to go forward. Let's change this. And it was horrifying because you thought, well, I don't think that's actually what Doctor Who fans want. And it was that thing of going, well, can we just finish all of the existing episodes first? And then absolutely, then at that point we'll let fans make up their own adventures using the telesnaps. And I'm really glad that we never actually got to the end of doing the telesnaps.
A Doctor Who photo novel generator wasn't the only strange idea flying around.
We paid people loads of money to be VIPs on message boards because they were the stars.
Another project that came out of the Central New Media Department, which was based in Bush House, was the BBC iStudio.
So this rather expensive chat studio was built with these large glass windows and a big display panel.
It's this incredibly expensive studio with massive plate glass windows. We had it that people would be able to gather and watch these web chats take place.
And there was a big drive to get big names in. Unfortunately, big names cost money, and so we tended to struggle a bit.
And I remember going to watch one, which was Gillian Anderson from the X-Files, and effectively you were watching someone being interviewed, but you couldn't hear the sound, and it was cold because you were standing outside, and there was some text scrolling on a sort of LCD or a dot matrix kind of display of what was going to be on the website, and it was a curious experience.
When somebody sees somebody in this kind of goldfish bowl, they would be running across the road. The worst times were Blazing Squad, I think, came into the studio, and it just brought Holborn and the Strand to a standstill.
Bush House wasn't particularly known as a BBC venue. You maybe could have made a success of it in Broadcasting House or a television centre, but not really at Bush House, not least of which because the studio was set directly behind where all the buses park when they're terminated at Aldwych. So from across the road, all you could see was buses anyway. You wouldn't even know the studio was there.
Another plan was to launch a webcam of the TARDIS with newly filmed footage. The cameras rolled at the BBC. The date was September the 11th, 2001.
So September the 11th, 2001 was the first, I guess, major event where people realised how important the internet was going to be as a news providing source. And one of the things I remember from that day is that Google was criticised because when you were searching for World Trade Center in the afternoon, after the towers had collapsed, one of the really high search results was promising a webcam view from the top of the buildings. And I think that started Google realising that people would be searching for news stories. I was working in Bush House at the time. The systems really, really struggled to cope, and I remember at one point there were reports that Canary Wharf had been evacuated, and this went up as a headline next to a picture of smoke pouring out of the World Trade Center in the States. And then there was the realisation that, maybe that's misleading, maybe that will make people think smoke's coming out of Canary Wharf. and then the realisation that actually the server was so busy you couldn't connect to the server internally from the BBC in order to edit the page, and that this mistake was sitting there.
The BBC now had an idea of how important its website was worldwide.
They served the website simultaneously from the UK and from New York. International users would get directed to the pages that were being served in New York, and UK-based users would get the pages from London. And the servers were located very, very close to the World Trade Center. So actually, the computers that were trying to produce those pages were at the epicenter of the disaster.
The BBC website, that week called bbc.co.uk, expanded rapidly, publishing thousands of pages of content a day. And over the next 2 years, the BBC's Doctor Who webcasts gradually became a little more animated.
There was a 2-year gap between the start of Death Comes to Time, where we had really, really tiny pictures and not very many of them, and Shalka happened 2 years later, and by that time it was already full screen, nearly animated.
Each time the BBC website did Doctor Who, the technology had improved. There was a bit more bandwidth. The screen size got bigger. The animation got gradually more sophisticated. It's still, effectively just a series of images strung together in an audio slideshow, but it began to feel a bit more like it was approaching a cartoon, up to the point where you get to Scream of the Shalka, where really it does feel like a proper grown-up animation.
Meanwhile, a man called Ben had come up with a remarkable idea.
I didn't set out to invent the iPlayer. I was just going through a messy divorce. I had some time on my hands, and I was over Christmas. This sort of eureka moment came to me, which was a combination of downloading too much stuff on torrenting sites, and it just seemed to make perfect sense that why couldn't you actually have a personal video recorder, as opposed to recording programs in the future. It could actually go in the past, a time machine, so 7 days in the past. I actually found that in the process of trying to persuade people that the iPlayer was a good idea, it took exactly 82 presentations around the BBC before I actually got to present to the Greg Dyke, the Director General at this time. And the sheer number of reasons which I got from people about why this was a terrible idea, I wrote all of them down. I came up with about sort of 90 to 100 questions about why it was a bad idea, and I made sure I had answers for every single one of them, because there were so many negatives about why it wasn't possible that I had to turn all of those into positives.
Downloaded shows appear in a media library, and all content is copy protected using digital rights management, so 7 days after broadcast it can no longer be viewed. And it can even be used with portable devices like PDAs or the latest mobile phones.
It was just going on forever. 4.5 to 5 years or so it took to actually get the thing live.
I think it will be used as more and more households have faster, more powerful computers. It may take some of the impetus from the video recorder.
While Ben was making his 83 presentations, the Doctor Who website's uniquely passionate audience was being used to test out new technologies.
What does the word TARDIS mean?
And I think the cult site and all of the things that came out with it, it was a space where we could try new things, where we could do things differently, where we could experiment and we could break new ground, and we could do it in media that wasn't just about television and radio.
There'd been a whole range of Virgin Doctor Who stories, and I noticed that these Virgin Doctor Who books were out of print, and one of them, The Dying Days, one of my favourite books, was on sale on eBay for something like £200 a copy. And I thought, well, couldn't we just license that and put it up online? And this was almost a decade before the Kindle was invented. We were making ebooks available, which sounds ludicrous because there was no such thing as an e-reader, so we were putting ebooks up even though there was no way for people to actually read them, because sitting there reading a book, squinting on a cathode ray screen would just be ludicrous. But the thing is, they were still very successful, even though there was no way for people to read an ebook. I mean, the best way of actually reading an ebook on the Doctor Who website was to print the whole thing out.
Not everything about the BBC website, that week called BBC Online, was so successful.
I remember that the message boards were quite difficult to run on our servers, which had this quirky name of Howard 2.
Howard with an E, as in Frankie Howard. It was based on the pun. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum, because it was an internet forum on the BBC website.
I remember the Doctor Who message boards were quite an exciting place to come and chat, but they were also quite challenging to manage as well, because quite a dynamic kind of group of people would go on there and talk passionately about the show.
There was nothing worse than going home at night, having had a good day at work, coming in the next morning and discovering that overnight something really horrid had happened on the message boards.
It was vile. It was literally, there was like stuff that the moment Doctor Who was announced coming back with me, there was stuff that I considered to be homophobic about me. There was, I think, it ran for a while, that message board. It was because we cast Billy, and I remember reading genuinely offensive remarks about casting a pop star and stuff like that. And I think it must have run for a while, because it took me a long time to realise how much power I had. And that's very true. Actually, you don't know how much power you have until you start to exercise it. And that's when I said, I think this should be shut down.
And it was just a godsend to just be able to go, yes, we finally have the excuse we need, and we can actually spend this money actually on making a website that people enjoy.
By 2004, the Doctor Who and cult websites were an enormous success, beaten only by news and weather, with a huge audience and hundreds of thousands of pages. But there was a problem.
The closing of the cult site was a marker on the BBC's journey from doing, being able to do anything, sort of the Wild West of the internet, to one where it had to have a much more closely regulated and accountable position.
At the time, I suppose in the mid-2000s, there was a lot of pressure on the BBC to do less on the web. So there were a lot of complaints from publishers that because the BBC was doing things, they weren't able to open their own websites.
Every year when it was budget meetings, the Doctor Who website's budget was cut, and you'd always be told, well, the thing about Doctor Who, there's not many years left in it, is there? So I genuinely think if Doctor Who hadn't been announced as coming back to television, the cult site was shut down in early 2005, and I think the Doctor Who website would have gone as well.
In 2007, the iPlayer launched.
The thing that I enjoy most is actually going on a train and or on the tube and watching people looking at the iPlayer. That makes me feel good, and I think that's when I kind of secretly smile to myself, and that makes me feel good.
The BBC website's days as a vast online magazine were numbered.
It's not a place for wild experimentation anymore, unfortunately. It's a very good card index for a very good DVD collection.
And I think the cult site had a bravery about it that was really, really important. And I very much hope that the BBC finds that kind of bravery again in the future.
It was just a lovely, quirky ragbag of interesting things to people who were interested in technology and television and ghosts and science. It was just an amazing bunch of stuff in one place on the web.
In a little more than a decade, the BBC website had grown from a few pages to the world's largest online broadcaster. Doctor Who was there at the start with a handful of tiny JPEGs. And Doctor Who is there now, one of the most popular programmes on the iPlayer. The internet's only going to get faster and more ambitious. But no matter how much it changes, can it keep up with the Doctor?